Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Smeltzer, one of 2 or 3 Mikes you're going to hear from. You have to be named Mike to work for UC2B as part of the plan. I've actually worked with the University of Illinois. I've been involved in this probably since 1997, which doesn't seem possible, but it's true, and we'll take you through that experience. Mike Hosier from Champaign Telephone is also here today, and he's going to tell you about some of the things they're doing relative to this. This is going to kind of be a basic lesson, history, if you will, of UC2B, to kind of get you all up to the same point in terms of what we're doing and what's going on as we speak. Let's see if I can make the controls work here. All right, history. Way back when, the Chamber of Commerce was involved in an organization called CCNet. Anyone here remember CCNet? The original incarnation of CCNet. It's risen in a new form these days, but Larry Smarr from NCSA came to the Chamber and said, you know, there's this thing coming called the Internet, and you guys might want to take advantage of it. And the Chamber said, sure. So one thing led to another, and we actually had some of the first broadband anywhere right here in this community. The Chamber partnered with Time Warner Cable, and there were probably 20, 25 cable modems spread throughout the community. This was a very early cable modem system. The Internet came to you over the cable modem, but your upstream was a dial-up line. So it was pretty slow to send stuff. It was pretty good for receiving stuff. We learned some interesting security lessons back then. The News-Gazette was one of the anchor locations for this. District 116 headquarters were one of the locations for this. And it was all one big network. And one day I got a call from the News-Gazette saying, you know, you might want to tell the superintendent in Urbana to turn off file sharing or at least file protect his files. Because in fact, the News-Gazette reporters had total access to the superintendent's hard drive at that point because it was all one big network. He used an Apple, they used an Apple. Everything just played nicely with each other even though they were halfway across town. At the same time, they also said, you know, Busey Bank's servers, one's called payroll, one called accounting, one's called this. And so we learned a lot about security at that point because up until then, we'd all kind of been little islands and we didn't have to worry about the outside world, you know, peeking inside our firewalls. Later, the Chamber partnered with Ameritech on an ISDN project. We had probably 200 homes and businesses in the community that were hooked up to ISDN, which at that point was 144 kilobits. And boy, were we excited to have that much speed. I think it was like $200 a month even. It was crazy. Around the same time, the university issued an RFP. The university has long sought to get equal connectivity to our students that live on campus and students that live off campus. Hendrick House, Bromley Hall, all the fraternities and sororities. And a company called McLeod USA, which morphed into Paytech, which is now morphed into Windstream, responded to that RFP and said, okay, we'd like to put better connectivity into these multiple dwelling units. And so McLeod came in and put fiber on the Champaign side of campus and reached probably 30 or 40 fraternities and sororities, Bromley, Illini Tower, those kinds of places. And in Urbana, they tried something new called DSL, which was kind of new and exciting back then. And for a long time, 4 or 5 years, McLeod served probably about 10,000 students on that system. Now that fiber's still there, it's still being used. The DSL has been supplanted by other things. So the university was kind of a driver of this going back as late as 1999. I mentioned I've been doing this for a while. I used to have an ISP business, and Larry Smarr was actually one of our customers. It didn't start out as an ISP business, but he convinced us that's what we should do. And so I went to the city council in Champaign and said, you know, you guys need to have a plan for doing fiber. And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they were right, of course, but I realized after I came out of that meeting that I didn't really have much of a plan, so we created a plan, and we called it CUNet 2000 because we thought it would only take 3 years to get it done, and by year 2000 we'd have the fiber built and everything would be wonderful. If you look at some of the original maps for CUNet 2000 and you look at the maps that we have for what we're doing today, they're pretty darn similar. I ended up going to work for McLeod and working on their fiber project for a while and then went to work for the university, so the big broadband concept kind of dried up for a while. And then in 2008, an organization called EDUCAUSE, which is a conglomeration of the high-tech universities, if you will, published a white paper, and they basically said, you know, for $200 billion, we could put fiber into every home in the United States of America. It'd be easy to do. If the government did it once, we'd be done. That started some thinking. I came back from that, and the EDUCAUSE plan was to have the federal government pay a third, state governments pay a third, and local governments pay a third. I came back and talked to folks on campus and said, you know, I don't think the federal government's ever going to come up with money to do this. I don't think the state government's ever going to come up with money to do this, but we've got 3 entities here. We've got Champaign, we got Urbana, we got the university. What if we all got together and split it 3 ways and built it ourselves? And I was actually working on that. And the Cable Commission appointed a group called the Broadband Access Committee, and I quickly got absorbed into that. And they started having some forums and discussions. And then we elected President Obama, and one of his first things he did was, of course, the stimulus package. And the stimulus package had $7 billion earmarked for broadband throughout the country. There was a competition, and I had been to a presentation in Washington in January, right before the inauguration, where this was being talked about. And I came back and talked up here a little bit, and we actually invited a consultant from DC to come out. And on the same day that Obama signed the stimulus package, Joanne Hovis was here at the iHotel doing a presentation about how we could get on board and perhaps get some of this money. So we did that. We put together an intergovernmental consortium of the 2 cities and the university. We applied for $32 billion, I think, originally. 32 million, I exaggerate. We had local matching money we had to come up with, at least a 20% local match. And about halfway through the application process, we had about 8 weeks to do that, the state, our good friend Governor Quinn, said, you know, broadband's important, and he snuck $50 million into the capital program that was dedicated to broadband to help local organizations or communities come up with their 20% match. So in our case, because the state was willing to come up with 10% of our match, we only had to come up with 10% ourselves, which meant that every dollar we raised locally was leveraged 9 times between the state money and the federal money. So that was a good plan. To make a long story short, we applied, and we were funded. They knocked us down a little bit in terms of our total request, but it ended up being a $29.4 million project. The university and the 2 cities are the prime movers behind it. The state gave us $3.5 million, and we raised about $3.4 million locally. What's it going to do? There's really 2 halves of the UC2B project. Half the money, almost to the penny, is spent building rings throughout the community. There's actually 7 of them, and we'll see some pictures of those in a bit. And those rings are to connect community anchor institutions. The legislation defined community anchor institutions somewhat narrowly, but there was also language in the legislation that said organizations that serve vulnerable populations. So we extrapolated that and said, all right, what's a vulnerable population? Well, poor people are vulnerable. Old people are vulnerable, very young people are vulnerable, disabled people are vulnerable, homeless people are vulnerable. So we added all the organizations to the normal ones, and we had a very exhaustive list of anchor institutions, schools, hospitals, libraries, kind of the normal things. And we were the only program in the country that took that approach. We have 200 plus anchor institutions in 50 square miles. There's a project in Southern Illinois that's 29 counties, and I think they have 200 anchor institutions across those 29 counties. So we went very deep into the community trying to work with organizations that affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And I think that was one of the reasons we were successful. The second half of the project was a fiber to the home pilot project. We were able to document that there were 11 census block groups based on the 2000 census that had less than 41% adoption of broadband, and that was the threshold that the government had set. They also defined what broadband was, and it wasn't a particularly high threshold. But we ended up with 11 that qualified, and so we could then build a fiber to the home system in those 11 census block groups, and you'll see those on the map in a minute. And out of that, we predicted that we'd get roughly half of those homes and businesses in those 11 census block groups to sign up as customers. Some people thought I was crazy, we'd never get 50%. Some people thought I was crazy, we'd get way more than 50%. Time will tell how crazy I actually am and why. This is where the money came from. Universities involved. All these organizations you see here basically contributed money in exchange for getting access to some dark fiber on the rings. Champaign Telephones is here, for instance. They thought it was in their best interest to own some of the fiber, and so we kind of pre-sold some of the dark fiber to these organizations. They were the only private sector. Sanitary District is one. I don't know anybody from Sanitary District here today? I'll talk about them then. I never expected the Sanitary District to need dark fiber. It turns out that the Sanitary District has 2 processing plants, we all know that. They also have pumping stations all over town. And it's real important to keep the pumping stations in sync with the processing stations. If they're pumping more than they're processing, bad things happen. And so they wanted access to the fiber just to make sure they had good communications between the various parts of their systems. Mass transit, CU Mass Transit. I wasn't expecting the MTD necessarily to have any need for this. It turns out they got a federal grant to do security cameras and kiosks in a lot of their bus terminals. They didn't have any way to get that data from those security cameras back to their offices. So long before there was the stabbing incident in the transportation center, they were already making plans to put security cameras throughout the system, and so they've bought fiber on the rings in order to facilitate that. The schools, you would expect, the cities had some needs as well, and the university, we had needs. There are many places that the university leases space off campus. Some of you may be landlords involved in that. When we move a department to an off-campus building, they want the same access to the university network off campus as they have as if they were on campus. And by having this dark fiber, or access to this dark fiber, that allow us to do that. So the 7 rings, and we'll show you those in a minute. We originally showed 143 community anchor institutions. I've lived here for 40 years, so I kind of thought I knew all the organizations there were. No sooner had we turned in this 143 than people started calling and says, I'm not on your list. How come I'm not on your list? And some of them were just brain dead. I didn't have the United Way on my list, for God's sakes. So we've created an alternate or an additional list of anchors that has, I think, about 50 organizations on it that we hope will have enough funds to do. But right now, NTIA is holding us to our original 143 that we submitted. Now, the good news is that a lot of those organizations we missed are in the, if you look at the map over there, those yellow zones. These are all the places where fiber to the home is going to be built. And if there was, who did I forget? Oh, I don't know. Let's say the public health district up here. They're in the fiber to the home area. We're going to put fiber in front of every single home, every single business, every single church, school, you name it, that's in that area. So the public health district, I had them on my list, but if I hadn't had them on the list, they just look like any other customer to us. We're already building the fiber there and signing them up. Doesn't really cost us much of anything because we want to sign up a lot of people in those areas anyway. So we found about 40 additional organizations that were in the fiber to the home area that we were able to add to the list. Actually, it's more like 50, I guess. So our list is now up a little over 200. In some cases, there are multiple organizations in the same building. What is it, where the chamber used to be? Was it 1817 South Neal? There are 3 or 4 different organizations that by themselves could all be considered anchor institutions. We only have to build fiber in there once to serve all of them. So that works out well. This is the list, and you can't see this, but if you picked up one of the handouts here on the back of the map, is a list of those original anchor institutions. I will get a copy of this presentation to the EDC so they can get it out to you. It's about a 4 meg file, but hopefully that won't break your email systems, so you'll be able to see that. And there's kind of the usual suspects here, the schools, the libraries. We did a lot of park district sites, a lot of senior living sites, most of the larger medical facilities, a lot of public safety. Public safety was also one of the emphasis of the legislation. And then, of course, some government locations as well. We got a notice, actually it's been there all along and I didn't really believe it, but we got a notice yesterday saying, by the way, you can't build any aquariums, pools, or golf courses. And I said, okay. I thought we couldn't build a pool, aquarium, or a golf course, but putting connectivity to them didn't seem like it was that big of a deal. Well, apparently that's verboten. So I've got 2 pools and an aquatic center on here. They're going to have to fend for themselves. We'll have fiber in front of them, but the grant won't allow us to build into Shoalin Pool. This is what the rings look like in a very logical sense. They all converge on the university nodes 8 and 9. I could tell you where those are, but I'd have to kill you. Ever since 9/11, we're not allowed to talk about where the nodes are, but they're on campus. And we have a lot of fiber. In fact, the fiber between the nodes is now totally installed. They did that over the last couple of weeks. And these rings branch out. There's 3 of them primarily in Urbana. There's 4 of them that are primarily in Champaign. Actually, each ring is in both communities, although the 3 in Urbana are primarily Urbana and so forth. That's what they look like logically. This is pretty much the same map you see here. That north ring in Champaign starts on the north side of campus, works its way to the north, snakes its way down through here, and comes up into the research park. And they all They all start in one place and they all end at the other. So they're not technically rings, they're more like a capital letter C. They always start in one node, they always end in the other node, and there's electronics in both places. And what that allows us to do is to set up the equipment on the backside so it's redundant. If you're connected on a ring and you've got a ringed connection, we can take a backhoe hit. We can have a ring totally cut and it feeds, the electronics feed the other direction. Now, not everybody wants to spend the money to do that, but if you have a business where redundancy is very, very important, you can't afford any downtime, we can set this up in such a way that short of having 2 bad backhoe incidences in the same day, you're going to be covered against that kind of problem. This is one of the more heavily populated rings. This is that North Ring in Champaign. And you can see by having lots of different kinds of organizations on here, there are 216 strands of fiber on each ring. And we don't necessarily have to use a single strand of fiber for each one. Some of these would sharing, but we've got public safety facilities, we've got schools, we've got computing centers, we've got medical facilities, senior centers, youth centers, and government facilities, all on that one ring. This is probably the busiest of the rings, but you get the effect that as we go around all these other areas, you've got lots of different kinds of organizations, but they're all sharing the same infrastructure. This makes sense financially because everybody is sharing that same infrastructure and sharing the maintenance on that infrastructure, and the government primarily is picking up the original cost of installing it. The fiber to the premise is the second half of UC2B. In the industry, it's called last mile services. In this case, it's more like last couple hundred feet because we're already putting manholes and handholds in front of every single parcel that's occupied in those 11 census block groups. There are roughly 4,650 households in that area. Households are not necessarily homes, because as soon as you have an apartment building, you could have 50 households within one structure, and so that complicates it a little bit. And there are roughly 200 businesses in there. UC2B is going to be in the internet selling business. The only way this makes sense financially in terms of being able to sustain it is to buy internet for, I don't know, $5 in Chicago and sell it here for $20. The margin in selling that internet is what allows us to have staff to fix things and so forth. There will be tiers of service. In the low-income areas, and not necessarily all low-income areas, but in the grant-funded areas, we'll have 3 tiers of service starting at 20 megabits per second symmetrical. Does anybody think they have 20 megabits symmetrical in their home now? Didn't think so. That's going to be great service. And it's going to be a true 20 megabits, not up to, or maybe if the planets are all aligned correctly and the sun doesn't shine, you'll get 20 megabits. You should get 20 megabits every day symmetrically upstream, downstream. The equipment can support that. The other thing that we're doing is we're creating a gigabit local network. So regardless of how much speed you pay out to the internet, you'll have a gig to the schools, you'll have a gig to the library, you'll have a gig to City Hall. You've got a Parkland student in your household, they'll have a gig to Parkland College. They can do their homework at better speeds from your basement or from your living room than they can probably sitting in a computer lab at Parkland. And that will work for Unit 4, that'll work for District 116, that'll work for every local private school as well. We tried to get everybody on board with this, and this gig local network has got tremendous value. If you're an employer, there might be 1 or 2 employers here, your company is hooked up to this, your employees, regardless of what they pay for internet, and this is going to be cheap internet, will have a gigabit connection to your office. And I think long term, that's the wonderful thing. There are, Wolfram, just name one company, my guess would be very interested in their employees being able to work at home from nights, weekends. The university is certainly interested in that for the university employees. That's one of the real benefits of the way we've architected this, is that there's always that gigabit connection to everything that's local. We are not going to be specifically in the telephone business or the video business. We certainly hope that there will be companies that come along and sell telephone services, that sell video services over this. There are companies that have IP-based television services that look a lot like cable TV. In fact, Dish Networks just hooked up with the big Utah state network that works similar to ours. Dish Networks is going to offer their services, could have been DirecTV, one of those two, over the fiber. They've already got rights to the programming, they already do all the things you would expect a TV company to do. This is just a much more efficient distribution mechanism for them. They have to bring the signal down once and they can go out over the fiber system. That just came out in the news today. There are already a variety of services out there. Netflix, Apple, iTunes, Hulu, Vudu. I just came back from vacation, I'm sorry to say. But we watched Netflix on my wife's iPad in the middle of Hawaii. And it worked just fine. It wasn't great connectivity, but if there were shows we wanted to see or wanted to catch up on something on the network, you can go tune into NBC, you can tune into ABC, and you can watch commercial television over the internet pretty darn easily, and it's free. Now, yes, you have to watch some ads, so it's not totally free, but broadcast television, you have to watch some ads. So it's a very similar situation. I believe that over the next 4 to 5 years, you'll see enough content moving online that you may not need the cable company any longer. Now, that's not good news if you work for the cable company. They're doing things to remain relevant or try to remain relevant, but an awful lot of information, a lot of programming is available online now, and I think that's just going to increase with time. And Apple is certainly trying to push that in that direction as well. So that base 20 megabit service, $19.99 a month. That's probably less than what some of you pay for far less bandwidth now. It's subsidized in those grant areas for 5 years due to a contribution from the university, but the speeds outside, or the costs outside the area, are not going to be 10 times that much. This is going to be very affordable, and as sooner we can get it out to the rest of the community, the better. I'll talk a little more about that in a little bit. We hope that there will be other ISPs that get involved providing services. This is an open access architecture. One of the grant requirements is that any ISP that came along and said, I'd like to sell services over this fiber, we have to let them do that. Now, we can charge them for that, and we have to come up to a reasonable rate for doing that. But nonetheless, the hope is that as a consumer, you'll have a choice of maybe 5 different internet companies. And if one of them really irritates you by their customer service or their collections or their bills or whatever, you can go online, change to company B. And if they irritate you, you can change to company C. Exact same wires, exact same equipment in your home. You don't have to do anything differently, and they'll all be able to offer that same sort of service. There is the system in Utah I referred to, I think is now up to 16 different service providers. Not all of them are doing internet. Some of them are doing home security. Some are doing backup data storage. Some of them are doing telephones. There's a variety of different things. But the idea is this should be the last piece of cable that ever has to come into your home or business. That it's a shared resource, that many different providers can make access to use it. And if AT&T or Comcast wanted to use it, we would let them do that. We would, of course, charge them an appropriate fee for doing that, whatever that appropriate fee might be. But nonetheless, it's available to all comers. And that's built into the system. The government would take our money back if we tried to do anything differently. I talked a little bit about open access networks. There are some companies we've already been talking to. Some of them have representatives here tonight: Champaign Telephone, Pavlov, Volo, and Shouting Ground. None of them at this point have specifically said, yes, we're going to offer this service over UC2B for this many dollars a month. We're getting very close to where we'll have those discussions, and those things will start to happen. All data is treated the same. We won't have, at least UC2B, as long as I have anything to say about it, will not have caps. If you have a 20 megabit connection, you've got a 20 megabit connection. You can run it at 20 megabits day or night, whatever. I don't know what you do with it eventually. You download the entire internet at some point, but if that's what makes you happy, go for it. Why fiber to the premise? Fiber is really the only future-proof technology. People ask me a lot, oh, why can't we just use wireless? Well, wireless is a shared bandwidth. As you've all seen at a football game or any time there's something big going on where you get a lot of wireless, in terms of cellular users, everybody's performance drops off. Fiber is the only way of guaranteeing getting bandwidth from point A to point B in sufficient quantities. It lasts a very, very long time. They don't exactly know how long fiber will last because it's in the 30 to 40 year range. The original fiber that was put in 25 years ago, people thought might last 20 years, because every time it thaws and freezes, it gets a little cloudier each year. Not a lot cloudier, but a little. It degrades a little bit. But there's fiber that Consolidated put in the mid-'80s that's still working just fine. And it's, what, 25 years now and going. So the fiber has gotten better in terms of installation. The stuff we're putting in literally was made in January. And it should last a very, very long time. You can always add different electronics to make it go faster, but there's no physical limitation on what the fiber can do. If 10 years from now we need to go 100 times faster than what we do today for some reason, fine, you put different electronics on either end. The big expense is getting all that stuff in the ground in the first place. That'll all be done. This is stimulus money that's paying for this. Well, who's going to pay for the stimulus money? Well, right, it's probably our grandchildren. And so we're putting in a system that our grandchildren are going to be able to enjoy. This happens to be one of my grandchildren. His dad's here somewhere. Her dad's here. But so much for political comments. Why symmetric gigabit? We actually started out, and this is, I'll blame it all on Google, we started out and we proposed a 100 megabit system. We were going to have that same 100 megabits locally, and you'd buy tiers of internet. And I'd go to the Urbana City Council and say, oh, we're going to put 100 megabits into low-income homes, and people would look at me like I was freaking crazy. What are poor people going to do with 100 megabits? And right in the middle of the evaluation process for this, Google came out with a Google Fiber project. And Google said it was looking for communities that wanted to build a gigabit into everybody's home. Next time I went back to the Urbana City Council is, how come you're only doing 100 megs? What kind of Neanderthal are you? Why aren't you doing a gigabit? That's how fast the conversation changed from 100 megabit being too much to a gigabit was about the only thing that would be acceptable. As it turned out, when we selected our electronics vendor, the cost for their gigabit equipment was almost the exact same as for their 100 megs, so there wasn't any point in even talking about the 100 megs, so we just jumped right to the gig. And that's what Google is doing, that's what Australia is doing, New Zealand's doing, Hong Kong, Singapore, places that are doing this in a big way, Chattanooga, Lafayette, Louisiana, they're all going to a gigabit. Now what Google's going to do is they're going to give people a gigabit to the internet. And if you're as big as Google and they're doing as big areas they are, that's probably doable. Now that's not going to be 20 bucks a month. So we're starting small, but someday we could do a gigabit to the internet if we had a big enough customer base and costs continue to come down. Fiber also lets us go symmetrically. If you're on DSL now or if you're on a cable modem now, you know that downloading information happens much faster than sending. If you create videos, if you take pictures of your kids and try and ship them off to your friends and relatives, uploading takes an awful long time. This will be symmetric connectivity, the exact same speed up, the exact same speed down. You know, YouTube is kind of the prime mover behind this. I've only uploaded, I think, one video in my life to YouTube, but an awful lot of people spend a lot of time uploading videos to YouTube, so having upstream bandwidth is important. If you think about your business uses, companies can't push the cloud architecture on as fast enough. You want remote data recovery, you want backups, you want storage offsite. Your ability to get your data to that other site depends on your upstream bandwidth. So having symmetrical bandwidth we think is going to be very important. What's it all look like? You've probably seen it all around town at this point. It's kind of hard to avoid. Right now, most of the activity you're seeing is putting conduit in the ground. In most places, they're putting just a single conduit. Some places we're putting 2 or 3. It just kind of depends where on the map you're talking about. These come in big monster rolls, and they traditionally do some directional boring to get there. Lots of manholes and handholds. A handhole is just a very small manhole. You don't need a really big manhole for everything you're doing. And in fact, the manholes that go in people's front yards are 12 by 18 inches. They're fairly small. That's what one of the little one looks like. They all have our logo on them, so you can tell them apart from everything else. The directional boring equipment comes in a lot of different flavors, but essentially there's a smart head, and they bore into the ground, and this guy here can tell exactly where that head is, how many inches below the surface it is, and he's sending controls back to this guy saying, all right, go a little left, go a little right, go a little bit up, go a little bit down. There's a lot of stuff already in the ground. There's sewer pipes, there's gas pipes, there's water pipes, there's phone lines, there's cable lines, there's lots of stuff. And in some areas, there's no congestion at all. In other areas, there's a lot of congestion. So sometimes they have to dig potholes just to go down and make sure that they know the exact height of something so they can maybe go in between a gas main and a phone conduit. And they've done a lot of that. And thus far, we've been fairly lucky in terms of not hitting a lot of things. This was a case where we actually did hit something. This was early in the going. That's actually not oil, it's just water in a neighborhood in Urbana. But we've gotten along pretty well with the water company these days. Early on, we had some issues. This gives you an idea of what a typical neighborhood looks like from the planning perspective. This is just a satellite map. Essentially, it's set up so that any 2 properties share a handhold. This sits on the property line out in the public right-of-way. So if they ordered service and they ordered service, we'd run a line from here and a line from there. concentrate, if you will, on these two homes down here, because it's kind of the same thing, but we've got a little bigger blow up of that. That handhold was designed to sit in the right-of-way between the two driveways, and this is what it actually ended up looking like. This is the handhold as it's being installed. The fiber cable will come up in here, and then when we eventually take cable from here into the house, we'll have to go under the driveway and in, or under the driveway and there, but that's reasonably easy. That part of the work hasn't started yet. Right now, we're doing all the work in the public right-of-way, getting the fiber to front of all those different buildings. So where are we today? This winter has been amazing. It just hasn't been like winter in terms of construction. We got started much later than we had hoped to, but we've really been able to catch up a lot. As of probably a week or so ago, I think we're about 55% of the conduit throughout the entire community, including all the fiber to the home areas, is already in the ground. The first fiber cables were installed in February. The city of Champaign is actually handling the logistics for the fiber to the premise going from the curb into the buildings. That RFP will come out this month, I'm sure. And the first customers will go live sometime in May. The grant runs out on February 1st, 2013. So we have, a couple hundred days to get all this done. It's 300 and some odd days. I have a little countdown clock on my phone just to keep me nervous. And any money we don't get spent by then, we lose. So we were very eager to get as much of this money spent as we can in the short term because it's going to go away on February 1st. And I think Richard has promised we won't let that happen. I saw, right? Do our best. We'll do our best. A little bit on how UC2B is going to be used. The short version is how to use the internet today. It's just going to be faster and it's going to be less expensive. You don't necessarily have to get much beyond that, but think about if the local library and our schools were no longer bandwidth constrained. The schools run out of bandwidth every day. The library runs out of bandwidth every day. And the libraries are one of the primary places that people that can't afford to have a computer at home go to, seek out jobs, fill out applications. It's pretty hard to apply for a job these days if you're not online. Senior living centers, those of you that have had parents in a facility like Windsor Savoy or Clark Lindsay, those are very nice facilities, but they can be pretty isolating. And imagine if your parents or your grandparents, whoever was living in there, had a computer and had access to email. My dad went through a place like that, and he spent a lot of his golden years checking out his old buddies from college or his buddies from the Air Force, and it kept him involved and kept him, pretty more involved than he would have otherwise been if he was just sitting around. Public safety agencies will use this. MedCAD was not an original investor in this. They just put up their radio system right before we started doing this. But they'll probably end up using some of our fiber as a backup to their radio towers. So should they have one radio link go down, they'll be able to use the fiber to keep their public safety things going. There are smart grid applications. Ameren, I'm sorry to say, is not as aggressive in this area as some utility companies are, but they'll get the religion at some point. Speaking of religion, there are churches that are talking about having Wednesday night virtual Bible study. Instead of getting out in the middle of winter and driving into Salem Baptist Church, going into your own living room and I'm running along. Okay, I will move right along. How else are we going to use it here? Some things we've already talked about, telemedicine. I think the folks at Carl and Christie and Covenant are drooling at the opportunity of maybe having their doctors be able to connect to their offices to read x-rays in the middle of the night from home and all the other things that having access to secure medical records would be good for them for. There's some interesting television stuff coming. It's still probably a year or two out. This is some of the ways UC2B helps local businesses. It has stimulated some of the economy locally because there's people out doing work that weren't doing work before. The fact that we're going to have competition or a third avenue of competition in this market will help restrain prices. In other municipalities where they've built fiber networks, the existing companies have stopped raising their rates. Now at this point, AT&T and Comcast don't seem to be too worried about us because they both raised their rates, what, 2 months ago? That may be the last rate increase you ever see from them because once this becomes real, they'll have true competition. What about your house? How many of you, when you first got that map, looked at the rings and figured out where your house was relative to that map? Okay, fess up, you all did it. How many of you looked and tried to figure out where your business was relative to that map? Same thing. There is no plan, as I stand here today, for what we do beyond the end of this grant. However, there are some opportunities coming that may allow us to tap into some extra resources externally, and that may happen as early as next month. So even though we're up to our necks in trying to do what we're doing now, we may have to have the conversation about how we expand it in the rest of the community. There's lots of different ways to get it done. It will be important politically for the business community to let it be known to your elected public officials, in this case our 2 city councils, that this is something that's important to you. There is no money in the grant right now to build to your business unless you're in one of those yellow zones. We may go right in front of you, but if you wanted to get connected to it right now, you'd have to pay for that connection. It's not overly expensive, but nonetheless, I'm hopeful that we will have a comprehensive plan, at least for Champaign, or at least for Urbana, or hopefully for the whole area, by the time it gets to be winter. So that when we come up on the construction season for 2013, we can figure out how we expand what we have. What about your business? There's the other thing I was just referring to is called Gigabit U. It's a consortium of 37 big research universities across the country that put out a proposal to the private sector saying, look, we're a good place to invest your money. We have a lot of bandwidth needs. We have a lot of smart people. Come invest money here. And there are some companies that came up with some interesting proposals, and we may be able to latch on to one of those. But as I said before, this is an open access network. There will be other companies other than UC2B, perhaps other than Champaign Telephone, that are going to start offering services over this in the near future. And I think competition is pretty much good for everybody. And that's what I think you're going to see.
Thanks for coming today, and also thanks to Bank Champaign and M2 for hosting the event. I've not been involved with the fiber project quite as long as Mike Smeltzer, really just since UC2B started. And speaking of UC2B and Mike Smeltzer, I think he deserves a pat on the back, if not a round of applause, for getting both cities, both school districts, MTD, Sanitary District, and Lincoln Trail, and the university to all agree on anything is quite a task. But how about a $30 million project? So thanks, Mike. So Mike's done a great job explaining UC2B and its history and how we got this far. And I enjoy talking about it to our customers. Everybody sees the orange conduit out at the street, and so I talk to people, businesses that we meet with, and talk about UC2B. And so I ask people, so do you know about UC2B? What's going on? And the internet, T1s, it's really fast, and that's about all anybody knows. It's not really a reality yet, and I think once people start experiencing the bandwidth that's going to be available on UC2B and the fiber, I think people will start to understand what it can do for your individual business. I know Mike talked a lot about the fiber to the home, and eventually it will evolve into hopefully some other neighborhoods. Our main focus is delivering internet bandwidth and connectivity and connections between multiple businesses, or businesses that have multiple branches. That's our main focus. And so we, as Mike said, if you've got one of the conduits out at the curb and you're interested in service, you don't need to wait until the next phase of UC2B. That's something that we can handle for you right now. So we've got a few people here, Mike Vrem from our office in the back, and Ben Wackler, Dan Malak are here. So if you've got any questions later, you can talk to them about what we might be able to do. So as Mike also said, Champaign Telephone is the only private investor and one of the largest contributors to the UC2B system. We're an ISP and a CLEC, Competitive Local Exchange Carrier for phone services. And we saw the value in this program because right now we rent services from or fiber services and transport services from AT&T, from the University of Illinois, and from Paytech. So our goal in this is to get services moved over to our own facilities, and that's what UC2B is going to do for us. So we're very excited about what UC2B can do and some of the services that we can provide. Mike's talked a lot about the 1 gig, which right now that's just unheard of in this market for regular businesses and definitely homes. So we're going to have the ability to really provide almost unlimited bandwidth and connectivity to the UC2B network as soon as we're able to actually build. So I know everybody's interested in pricing, and pricing's not really totally established yet. It's going to be somewhat a function of how much bandwidth we need. Mike talked about buying bandwidth in Chicago for $5, and he's right, maybe even less. Champaign's a pretty expensive place to buy bandwidth because there are really a limited number of providers. Comcast, AT&T, Paytech, some long-haul providers. So with UC2B and the transport that we're going to have available through one of our other providers, US Signal or even ICN, we'll be able to get to Chicago and bring bandwidth down here. And our goal at this point is to be able to offer $15 bandwidth, $15 per meg. Mike was talking about 20 meg band, $20 for 20 megs is kind of their goal. That's really for the anchor institutions and the low income, right? So our goal is to get pricing down in that, and obviously it's also symmetrical. So anyway, the other part of UC2B that's important to us or exciting to us, once we have all the anchor institutions and this fiber network built in Champaign-Urbana, one other thing, Mike, can you throw the data center thing up? Thanks. This summer, after UC2B really gets rolling, we have plans for a data center that will connect to the UC2B network. So a lot of the businesses that we talk to have a real problem with backups and what they do with their data, and even having problems storing operating servers, have power, generator, backup UPS, air conditioning issues. So we'll have a data center located on a lot just west of our office on Neal Street. It's going to be about 7,500 square feet. We'll hold about 180 racks, and that'll be connected to UC2B. So if you connect to UC2B, you'll be able to connect to that data center, again, at this minimum 1 gig speeds that we were talking about. So anyway, the connectivity to the data center will also connect to some long-haul carriers like US Signal, and that will allow you to get out of town. So if you wanted to get your data, not at a data center off South Neal in Champaign, but if you wanted to get that data to Chicago or St. Louis or Indy or beyond, you'll be able to hit our data center and then get out of town. So again, for disaster recovery, that's really key. So I know a lot of our current customers are locating data in Chicago, but they've got just a real bottleneck because of the transport cost and the bandwidth limitations on the connections that are available today. So anyway, one other, just kind of a side note, with all the cloud computing and gigabit connections and everything else, we're really talking mostly about data. The one other thing that Champaign Telephone, we actually do voice services as well, and with UC2B and with fiber, we can obviously provide high bandwidth storage in the data center, but we can also provide voice services. So as an alternative to, which we do that today, but on rented facilities. So going forward, we'll be able to provide voice services in addition to data on the UC2B fiber network. Mike mentioned the residential component and the devices that UC2B is going to install is going to have, or they will have a telephone line connection, and we'll be able to deliver voice services on there, on that device to an existing phone system, or on a SIP-based service, on a managed service. So that's just something else to consider. So that's just kind of a quick overview of Champaign Telephone and UC2B and some of the services that we're going to provide. And if you've got any questions, you can see one of us or obviously give us a call anytime.